guys are funny. There's like 4 people that clapped right there. Isn't it weird when you're in a giant crowd and you don't know if it's time to clap? Like, that's weird. I just like to point at the awkward because usually I'm the cause. Listen, about 10 years ago, we moved to Vegas about 7 years ago. About 10 years ago, I was in student ministry back in Illinois in the Midwest. And my wife and I had the privilege to drop our kids off with grandparents and go away for a couple days and just envision and pray about what God would shape our family to be. We had 3 kids at the time, and we wanted to do life as a family really, really well. And so we started at that point calling ourselves Team More, and we said that we were shaped by God and sent to heal. And we wanted all of our lives to be about God shaping us to be like His Son, and the things that God had given us to be about bringing life and healing to other people. And so my wife, who's a dreamer and sees things where they aren't in a good way, she looked at the front of our house and said, we never use those 2 rooms. We had a suburban house, a lot like many others, and there were 2 rooms in the front of the house you put furniture in that no one ever sits on. Everybody walks right past to the rest of the house. She said, what if we could do something better with that? She said, what if we turn the front of our house into a coffee shop? And I'm like, I like all of what you're saying right now. And so because we wanted our kids to kind of see what Dad did for a living, I love sitting down with people and helping them walk through the Bible and follow Jesus and talk about the challenges of their life and make their faith real in their life and that sort of thing. And so we could have people into our house. I'd be gone less. The kids would see us more, all this kind of stuff. It all looked really good. But I'm cheap, everybody, and furniture is not cheap, and I didn't know how to get an espresso machine. And so I'm the dream killer in the family. She's the dreamer, I'm the dream killer. It's how it works. And so anyway, there's a really amazing story about how God provided the perfect amount of furniture from a coffee shop there in town. It's an amazing story I've told before. But another piece of the story is that day I went to work and said, God provided this furniture in such an amazing way. I've got to tell you the story. And I have no idea where I'm going to get an espresso machine. And my buddy Brandon said, hey, come to my house this afternoon. So I came to his house that afternoon. He put his garage door up, and what's sitting in the back of his garage but a sweet espresso machine. And he's like, my father-in-law just gave this to me. He had it at a business. No one knew how to work it. Do you want it? And I'm like, yes, of course I do. And so he gives me this thing, and I take it home, and God provides in this amazing, amazing, amazing way, right? So that I can make some really mediocre coffee because I was terrible at using it. But here's the thing. I tell you that story for this. I want to ask you just a very, very simple question. Whose life got better when Brandon took something he had and gave it to someone who needed it? In fact, take just a second and tell the person next to you, if you could list all the people whose lives got better because someone who had something shared it with someone who needed something, how many people's lives, whose lives got better? Tell the person next to you right now. Go. Now, I hope that you listed at least 2 names, right? Because Brandon got to be this conveyor of something, right? He got to see the joy in my cheap face light up when I got an espresso machine for free, right? But he also got to step into this story of what God was doing in our family and in the student ministry and the life of this part of a city that we were living in, right? I got to have this amazing experience of God providing in just the right way at just the right time with a cool story on top of another cool story. And then every single time students showed up in my house, I'm like, what? You have a coffee shop in your house? I'm like, yes, let me tell you the story. 10 years later, I'm telling you the story. So many lives got better. In fact, here's what we're going to find out as we look at the life of Jesus and his teaching today. It's this. All of us get better when us who have share with us who are in need. All of us get better. All the students, Brandon, me, everybody. All of us get better when we share, when those of us who have share with those of us who are in need. Now, Jesus is going to challenge us, and if I were to give you the cliff notes of this whole message, in like the end game all the way from the beginning, it's this. Share with people in need. Right? This is a preschool lesson that we learned a long time ago, and today we're going to talk about some adult applications of that, okay? But here's what some people get wrong with Jesus sometimes, and I don't ever want to miss it, is while that is the place that we will land, of share what God has given us, when we have more than we need, we should share with those in need. We have the opportunity to share with those in need. But what Jesus is so awesome, this is why we follow him. This is why around here we say join Jesus. And whether you're on that path of joining Jesus or not, whether you're living in line with him or not, I don't know the answer to that. But I just want you to know that Jesus is not all about just the in-game action change. It's not just about behavioral change. Don't get me wrong, if you follow Jesus, your behavior will change. But it will change because Jesus changes your heart. And what we're going to talk about for the next little bit is how he goes about that. In fact, we're going to look at a lot of Luke chapter 12, and I would encourage you this week to read through Luke chapter 12. Jesus is going to do some heart-shaping change. He's going to point us and remind us of some truth that sets a foundation for everything he's going to call us to. He invites us into a joy that can only be experienced in some particular ways, and then he's going to tell us the action that actually gets us there. So, but don't skip steps. All the goodness of what God is up to in our lives is in all this work over here. The reminder and the peace he brings because he's a provider. The joy he invites us to experience as we give like Brandon gave. And then the change when we actually put that into action. So let me just start with the basis of all of this, right? We're not going to talk about us and them. We're just going to talk about us, all of us, right? All of us get better when those of us who have give to those of us who have in need. And so let's just start with this, that all of us are valuable. Let's talk to us who are valuable, okay? In fact, why don't you just turn to the person to your left and your right and behind you in front of you and just look at them in the eye and with conviction say, you are valuable. Go. All right, so let's just make it a little more personal. Look to your favorite of whichever those people are. I don't care. You just choose one this time. And tell them with conviction, I'm valuable. Listen, at the core of all of this, long before Jesus calls us into this action, he reminds us of this truth that we are valuable, that every single person you will ever lay your eyes on was created in the image of God. And regardless of what condition or state they are in, they have beauty, they have value, they are worthy of respect and honor, and they are worthy of a life that can be lived well. And Jesus invites all of us into that, right? And here's the thing, is that you got to believe it for you too, okay? And Jesus reminds us before this action to believe this and rest in this. All of Luke chapter 12, Jesus is calling people to live like God's a healthy provider. Live like God can take care of you and live generous lives. But to the foundation of all of that is God provides for us because he values us. Check this out in verse 6. What is the price of 5 sparrows? He says 2 copper coins maybe. Very, very small cost. Yet God does not forget a single one of them. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. What you need to begin hearing, and I'm going to say it 4 times, this is your first shot, is God says you are valuable. And to rest in that, he says, look, sparrows were the cheapest animal you could buy at the time of Jesus. You could get 5 for 2 copper coins. Jesus says, God knows every single one of those and cares for every single one of those, even though everyone would call them worthless. They were worth it to God. And he says, how much more are you worth? And so will God provide for us? Does he care about us? Are we valuable to him? He says, of course you are, Jesus says. This is the foundation. Don't miss it. You're more valuable than sparrows. And continuing with this bird theme, which is a little weird, go to verse 24. He says, look at the ravens. Now, if sparrows are about things that have almost no worth and God cares for them, so he cares for us, ravens are about things that are unclean. They were scavengers. They were around dead things, which to Jewish people made them unclean and unable to worship. And so Jesus uses them as an example. He says, even the unclean things, look at the ravens. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, and God feeds them. And you are far more, what? Valuable to him than any birds. So you can call something worthless, but God pays attention to it. And so he pays great attention to you. You can call something unclean, but God knows and provides for those birds too, and he will provide for you. Check this out in verse 28. He goes on and uses the analogy of flowers, which, by the way, last week I was up at Mount Rainier, and the wildflowers on that mountain are something else. But in just a few weeks, they're going to be gone. You got to be there at just the right time. And God says, he talks about lilies, and he says, listen, they are clothed with even more splendor than the greatest king in Jewish history. And he goes on in verse 28. And if God cares so wonderfully for flowers that are here today and thrown into the fire tomorrow, he will maybe care for you. No, he will certainly care for you. Sparrows, ravens, flowers, worthless, unclean, temporary, God cares for. So can he care for us? We're valuable. We can rest. What I hope is being produced in you right now is peace, that God's got you, that he's for you. In fact, if there's any part of you that believes it, why don't you just turn to the person next to you and say, I'm okay. I don't believe you. That was lousy. But you got to believe it before you get to the next piece, because there's always something attacking our sense of being okay. But in case you've missed it, let me just give you the fourth one. I promised you four. In verse 30 through 32, it says, your Father knows what you need, just so you know. He already knows. He's not unaware, okay? Don't think that you have needs and God doesn't know. He already knows. And he will give you everything you need. All right? So my son thinks he needs an iPhone. That's not the need we're talking about, okay? Not the same. Catch this. We'll talk about this a little more in a little bit. Verse 32. It gives your Father in heaven great happiness to give you the kingdom. Listen, before we go anywhere else, those of us especially who know the story of Jesus, who live in the story of Jesus, who have taken on Jesus' name as Christian, this is so foundational. In fact, it's the part that our enemy always tries to rip away from us so that we live differently and live without peace. Just so you know, God can and wants to provide for all of your needs. And he invites us into that. He expects us to work when we can. He expects us to contribute. We participate in that. But we don't live in worry because God's capable. So we can live at peace. It's one of the gifts of following Jesus. And in case you ever wonder about your value, you only need to look to the cross. If anyone were ever to put a price on you, Christian, you know this, that any price tag ever put on you would have to be Jesus. That's it. That's all it could say. Because God, who loved us so much, entered his creation, lived perfectly, and gave his life for us so that we could be connected to God. So there would never, ever, 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 ever be a moment that we would question our value or worth to God or his interest and concern to care for us and provide for us. Far more than worthless sparrows or unclean ravens or temporary flowers. And you've got to rest in that. He invites us to rest in that, to be at peace that God can and will and wants to and actually takes great pleasure in providing for us. Are you all with me? Hold on to that. You know why? Because every single one of us knows that peace is under constant attack, right? It just is. All of us are in on that. In fact, not only are all of us are people who are valuable, but all of us are people who are in need. All of us who are in need. Let's talk to us for just a minute. Now, some of us are in substantial, immediate, dire need. This is not Jesus' primary target audience, and it's probably not even the vast majority of us, but there are probably a few among us who live in some really substantial need right now, who are having to choose between food and shelter, who are having to choose between having a car and all kinds of other basic necessities that some of us take for granted. Some of us are having to choose between air conditioning and some sort of pest control that rids us of these grasshoppers, right? But for real, there are people living in dire need, okay? And I just want to pause for a second and say that the church should be there for you. The church organization and the church individuals should be there for you. And that's really part of the call of what Jesus invites us to that I'll get to more in a minute. But while I'm on the point, I want you to know that when we give our offerings here at Canyon Ridge, a percentage, 7% goes away from anything that's tied directly to the people of Canyon Ridge. And a big piece of that is for people who come in desperate need. We call it benevolence, and we try to meet immediate needs, whether they're food needs, shelter needs. We try to connect people with certain amounts of money that are able to be cleared right away to help people out of the immediate, desperate need that they're in. You don't have to live that way, okay? And the church should be there to show you how valuable God is for you, and we are. And it's why we help people into small groups, because every single time, no matter who we are, there are all of us who will be in different kinds of season of need. And us being in life groups together creates a community around us so that when we are in need, we learn to receive from them and they learn to give to us and vice versa. And so the church is always surrounding us, but let's not leave this institutional, okay? Don't let us hide behind that. This is not someone else's job. It's not their job. It's not just a political solution. It's not just an organizational solution. Jesus is calling us to personal heart change, where we live in such a way that those of us who have share with those in need, which is really where we're going today, right? And I got to take one more second and just say, we live in a world that has desperate need, wouldn't you say? I'm so grateful to God for the way He's provided for me and my family. I have more than I need. But there are people in the world, 1.3 billion of them, who live in some sort of multidimensional poverty. They either don't have access, they have 3 of 10 things, like not access to clean water, not access to fuel for heating, not access to fuel for cooking, not enough money to buy food, an income less than $1.90 a day. 660 million of them are kids. In our country alone, 13% of the population lives below the poverty line, which is an annual salary of $25,000 for a family of 4. That's a lot of people. 15.3 million of them are kids. 13% of those people in Nevada. 6.7% of people in Nevada living in extreme poverty. $13,000 a year or less for a family of 4. So there are real needs to be met. There are real opportunities, and really this thing that Jesus is calling us into, those of us who have moved into having more than we need, what do we do with that? There's a reason Jesus calls us into that. But it's not just people who are in need of provision, right? These are people who are in need of provision. They need money for food. They need a place to live. They need help out of poverty. They need to step into, and like an organization we partner with, HopeLink, that puts all the different resources from our city together to help people forward. We're also a people, all of us, those of us who have and those of us who are in need, all of us are in need of peace. Remember, we said that what Jesus has pointed us to, this value He's given us, helps us rest in peace, that God has got us. We don't have to panic. We don't have to worry all the time. All of us are under attack with that at different times. We're tempted to panic about our resources or fear giving things away or wondering if the next paycheck's going to be enough or all these different things that we make financial commitments that we can't always follow through on. This peace is under attack. And what the world will say that was what you need for peace is more stuff. And just so you know, that's not it. And Jesus says it in 4 different places very quickly. In chapter 12, you'll see it. Verse 22, He says this. That is why, first of all, that is why is from all the things I already told you. God can provide more than sparrows, ravens, flowers. He's a good Father. That is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food to eat or enough clothes to wear. That's not necessarily all of us. We worry a lot about the kind of food, preference of food, or the label of clothes and things that we wear. And He says, stop worrying about that. It's not worthy of your attention. You've been invited to more. And He says, stop worrying about it because He can provide what we need, right? Either He can or He can't. He says it again in verse 29. He says, and don't be concerned about what to eat and what to drink. Don't worry about such things. That first word says concerned. I love this. Have you ever seen somebody who, they're walking through the store and maybe they're pushing a grocery cart or something, and all of a sudden they just freeze and they're like this? You ever seen them? They're the people just like you who realize for just a second you might have lost your phone. You know what I'm saying? Have you had that moment where irrationally, for no apparent reason whatsoever, you just got to know it's there? You know what I'm saying? It's here. I'm okay. That kind of consuming concern is what Jesus says, don't do that. Don't act like that. I got you. You don't need to act like that. When you act like that, it makes people think I don't got you. I got you. And then He says, don't worry, and it's a different word for worry. Up in the air, back and forth, blown, not exactly sure how things are going to turn out, not confident that the God who spoke everything into existence is capable of making sure that you're okay. My friend Mark Moore calls it practical atheism. Not many of us would say, those of us especially who follow Jesus, certainly wouldn't call ourselves an atheist. He says, but we behave like one. God says He's a provider. And when we worry about our provision, what we're saying is, there's no God who's going to provide for me. We practice, we act like God's not, but He is. He says, I love this phrase, He says, when we worry, it shouts our doubts about God's ability to provide for us. Finally, in verse 32, He says it most clearly. He says, don't be afraid. Listen, Jesus invites us to peace. It's a gift. God says, I got you. You're in my family. I'll take care of you. And from that peace, then, he invites us into another need that every single one of us has. We are in need of purpose. This peace frees us to live with a totally different purpose. Our purpose doesn't need to be consuming, collecting, hoarding, protecting, and trying to find our insurance, our security, our peace in the acquisition of things or the collection of big bank accounts or any of these sorts of things. He says, no. We need a better purpose. And he gives it to us in Luke chapter 12, verse 30 and 31. He says, these things, like I've just listed, dominate the thoughts of unbelievers all over the world. But your Father already knows what your needs. So he says this, instead of seeking after stuff and trying to find security in something that can't provide it, he says, seek the kingdom of God above everything else. And God, he will give you everything you need. He says, seek my kingdom. You see, we live too small when we live for the purpose of self-provision. I'm not saying we don't work. I'm not saying we shouldn't manage our money. Don't flip the pendulum too far. But when we're concerned, when we're looking for like this all the time, what the next raise is, what the next provision is, what the next upgrade is, what the newest version is, all of these different things, we live too small. Jesus has invited us to a much greater purpose. In fact, Paul says it really clearly in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He says it this way, teach those who are rich. Now, if we were going to do a show of hands of who's rich, probably not a lot of hands would go up. But let me define rich for you as the Bible defines rich. Those who have more than they need. Anybody have more than they need? It says, teach those who have more than they need in this world not to be proud. Anybody ever tempted to be proud based on what you have or how you look? Teach them not to be proud and not to trust in their money. Anybody feel a different degree of peace when there's extra? No. It's so unreliable. Their trust should be where? In God, who richly gives. And by the way, like Jesus said, he loves to give. He richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. We should enjoy what God gives us. But then he says this, what do we do with our extra? Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need. Always being ready to what? Share with others, right? We have this whole other purpose. We live with peace that God can provide. So we need not fear giving away our extra, right? In fact, the pain sometimes that we experience or the fear that we sometimes experience when we start to give something away, what if I need it? What if something happens and things don't come through? Jesus was talking to people who lived day to day. They were one injury away from not being able to provide for their family the next day. They were one bad circumstance away from abject poverty. Most of us don't live in that world. And yet that same thing grips our heart and says, hold on to it. It's what makes you safe. Hold on to it. It's what means you'll be okay. And Jesus says, it's wrecking your heart because that's not where your security is. I got you. You'll be fine. You can give and give generously. Be rich, not in things, but in good works. And so let me talk for a minute because I think a lot of us fit this category. Let's talk to us who have, right? There are us who are in need, and all of us will be in different seasons like that at different times. That's why we surround ourselves with great people who follow Jesus too. But let's talk to us who have for just a minute. What the world will tell us constantly is that we should find joy in acquiring. That our joy comes from that next purchase, that next acquisition. That our enjoyment of life actually comes in the collection of things. But we all have lots of those things that have faded and we've tried to replace with the next thing. The problem is that when your joy is in acquiring, your identity is in your stuff. When my joy is in acquiring, our identity gets wrapped up in stuff, which is not worthy of our identity. It is not who we are. It is not what Jesus says who we are. In fact, there was a man who got confused about this. Jesus told a short story about him in Luke chapter 12, which I hope you read this week. You picking up on that yet? Verse 16, a rich man, what's rich mean? More than he needed. A rich man had a fertile farm and that produced fine crops. He said to himself, what should I do? He said, I don't have room for all my crops. I love this. If this guy was on social media, this is what we call a humble brag, right? Then he said, I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Classic upgrade. Then I'll have enough room to store all my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Does this sound a little bit like what our culture tells us to do? But God said to him, you fool, you will die this very night, and then who will get everything you work for? Verse 21, in case it wasn't clear, Jesus says, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. Let me just ask you, what makes my friend Brandon wise? Would he have been wise or a fool to leave his coffee maker in his garage in case one day he needed a coffee maker? Who would have changed? Who would have gotten better in him keeping his coffee maker? No one. Everything stays as is. But when he gives it, he lives in the peace that Jesus has provided for him. And he experiences the joy of being part of a story that God is writing in the lives of several people. And so who's the fool and who's wise? The world says wise is keep, give, hoard, collect, watch the number grow. And Jesus says, listen, don't live a life that tries to find joy in acquiring, because your identity will be in stuff. In fact, I was on vacation, and we were walking through a bookstore, and I saw this book called The Second Mountain, which I haven't read yet, so I take no accountability for what it actually says. But it said mountain on the front, and so I had to look at it. It's not about mountains at all, total disappointment. But it was really interesting, because he was a secular guy, not a follower of Jesus, at least as far as I know. It's not a Christian book, but he said the second mountain is what it's called. And he says a lot of people climb the ladder. They climb the first mountain to achievement and success as they've always dreamed of it. But he's been spending a lot of time with people who did that and finding that it was completely dissatisfying. And so they begin another climb on a second mountain toward meaning. And you know how they find it? By giving away. Listen, I'm here to tell you, Jesus says you don't have to climb the first mountain. The second mountain is where you should start. Your life will be found in giving it away, which is why Jesus doesn't say there's joy in acquiring, because your identity is not in stuff. He says there's joy in giving, and our identity is in him. It's why we bear his name. And we can find joy in giving because he has alleviated the fear and worry because he can provide. So he gives us the peace and then invites us to joy in giving. And this is exactly what God does. In fact, we said this in verse 30, 31, 32, I forget where it is, 32, I think. It says, the Father delights, he finds great happiness in giving you the kingdom. I want you to know, I studied this, and this is like insider baseball. You may not care about it all, but I got to tell you. That word for happiness is only used in two circumstances in all of the Gospels. One is in this one right here, measuring God's happiness in giving us his kingdom. The only other time that word is used is when God speaks to Jesus and says, this is my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. The degree with which God was pleased with Jesus' rescue of us is the same amount of pleasure he takes in giving to us. And when we take pleasure in giving to others in his name, we look a lot like him. And so let me just ask you, how will you measure your life? How will you measure your life? A lot of times in the midst of life, we measure it by the acquisition of things or the security we find in the amount of stuff or money that we have collected or the image that we're able to portray and the way that we look or what we drive or the place that we live. But that's not how anybody measures life at the end of life, is it? No one puts their bank account on the slide reel at any memorial I've ever been at. It's always the investment in others. The stories people tell don't talk about people's stuff. They talk about people's generosity. They talk about the relationships established along the way. It's why I think Jesus is right when he says life is not measured by how much you own. I get that culture says life is measured by how much you own. Your comfort, your joy is all in acquisition. But Jesus says, no. He says, it turns out it's better to give than receive. And because we know how much Jesus loves us, and because we know we are all of us valuable, we can live at peace, which frees us to experience the joy of giving. Are you finding all this heart change that Jesus is pointing us to? So now it's everyone's favorite verse. Are you ready? You've been waiting for this. You've been sweating for this because it's hot in here. Verse 33, you ready? Be ready to applaud. You're going to love this. You ready? What should all of us do? All of us should do this. Everyone, all of us who have, all of us who need, all of us who are valuable, all of us should do this. Be ready. Here it goes. Sell your possessions. No? No applause? Come on. We talked about this. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasure for you in heaven, and the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. The treasure works different for Jesus if you're not picking this up. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it. No moth can destroy. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. You see, Jesus is not saying, give me your stuff. Jesus is saying what? Give me your heart. He cares about real change in us. Living at peace, experiencing joy, making a difference. And so Jesus wants our heart, not our stuff. But you know how he's going to get to our heart? Our stuff. And so listen, we should obey Jesus. Not trying to make some outward activity change, but to embrace the peace, to force ourselves into a situation where we've got to rest in God's provision. And he'll write amazing stories of giving and providing. And we'll find our way into the life that, Paul says it this way, the life that is truly life. And so let me just ask you a simple question. What in your life is being stored that could have a greater impact if it was shared? What in your life is being stored? Which dollars are being stored that could have a greater impact if they were shared? Which things? Now, when Jesus says sell your possession, he's not talking about a garage sale where you get rid of the stuff you already don't want for 10% of what you originally paid. He's talking about what happened in Acts chapter 5 when Barnabas took an effective field that could have produced income and value and status for him, and he sold it and gave the money to the followers of Jesus and said, give this to people who need. He talked about market price, real time. In this culture, the way people's valuables worked was it was in stuff. It wasn't in some fictional number on the internet somewhere that we're not even sure is real. It was in real stuff. And so he said, no, take real stuff that really matters to you right now, but you just don't need it. It's more than you need. Take that, sell it, give it away. He says, in that way, you'll live in my peace. In that way, you'll experience my joy. In that way, you will be shaped. He'll be after our hearts. And so the question is, do we believe culture? Or do we act in trust of Jesus? You see, nothing changes in the keeping. We change. People change. Those in need come to know that God is a provider. When God's people, in his name, take the things that God has provided them, the more than enough that they have, and takes it out of storage and shares it into the lives of those who need. And God writes great stories. And so we do that together in several ways here. We do it through backpacks. Do it through compassion. Don't miss the chance to step into the life of a kid. But you'll find 100 other ways. Just walk around your garage. Take a peruse through your online account. Walk through the bedrooms, that room that you close off when all the guests come because it's a mess. It's so full of stuff. Go in there, right? Brave it. Careful. And ask this simple question. God, what am I storing that I should be sharing? And watch what happens as God produces peace and joy in all of us when those of us who have shares with those of us who need. Would you stand and pray with me? God, I just want to say thank you. I recognize that it is a privilege to live in a time and a place where more than enough is really a descriptor of my whole life. God, the way you've been generous with me is astounding. And in our country, on the whole, not entirely, but overall, we have so much. And God, thank you that you give us, you set us in a place of peace. God, help us embrace that peace and not deny you, not fail to acknowledge or live in line with you, but to live in peace that you've got us. God, help me with that. It's hard for me. God, help us place our trust so deeply in you that when we look at our things, of course we would want to. give it away. But God, I don't want to all the time, and so I need your help seeing, and the discipline and the bravery to just say yes a few times and then keep saying yes over and over to giving. God, help that for all of us. And God, I know that you are always true to your word. You always come through. You never fail. You will write stories of celebration that we will tell among ourselves for decades and declare how good and right you are. God, help us find our joy in giving and our identity in you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.